encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. This is the Light Network. If you want to be a serious Bible student, a successful servant, and a powerful preacher, this is the podcast for you. Hello and welcome to Preachers in Training. My name is Robert Hatfield, and this is the podcast where we talk about all things preaching and ministry. Welcome to Season 14, Episode 3. Today's topic, how to minister to a larger congregation. This is a request we actually received multiple times for this season, and the assumption is you're maybe moving or you recently moved to a congregation that is larger in size, more people to whom you are ministering than perhaps previously. Here to help us discuss this topic today, joining us from Elk City, Oklahoma, is Gantt Carter, who preaches for the Second and Adams congregation there in Elk City. Gantt, welcome back, brother. It's great to reconnect with you.
Yes, good to be back. I really appreciate the invitation, Robert.
Well, I'm excited about this. I know we've had you on before to talk about maybe preaching without notes. Does that sound right?
I believe so.
Yeah. Okay. Very good.
And I am using some notes for today's podcast. This isn't preaching, right? So.
Okay, that's true. Yeah, it's fine. We're not going to call you a hypocrite, even if you've changed your practices for
at least not now.
However long ago that was a long time ago now. So
it's been a couple of years or so.
Yeah.
So, I'm still preaching without notes, just so we're
good.
Clear.
Yeah, very good. Okay, good. So he's not retracting anything he said back in previous episodes. You have to be Second and Adams Church of Christ. I feel like I'm really having to enunciate that, but I'm assuming that is a pretty good description of your location there in Elk City, Oklahoma.
It might be. Yes.
Tell us about the congregation there. How long you been there?
We've been here, just over 5 years now.
Great.
Celebrated our fifth year, into the fifth year, how are you going to say that, last month.
Yeah.
And so,
okay.
And I guess especially as relates to this discussion,
mm-hmm.
I've been in full-time ministry as of this year for a decade. So not that long, but anyway. And I've had the privilege of working with 3 different congregations. And the first 2 were, and when we talk about numbers, it's all relative, really. Right?
That's right. Yeah.
1,000 people. Some people, that's a large congregation. Some people, 150 is a large. All of that, we could spend all day just discussing all the different perspectives on that, I guess.
Yeah.
Even within the brotherhood. But the first 2 congregations that I had the privilege of working with, they were both roughly the same size and what I think most of us would typically think of as being a small congregation. They were 50, 55 members along in there. And then when we made the transition to come here at Second Adams, at the time, it was about 250 members, somewhere along there.
Okay.
And then, we're still about there. Our attendance isn't quite there. We're in that post-COVID phase, like pretty much everybody is right now.
Yeah, isn't that the truth?
And so we're running 160s to 200 on a given Sunday morning. But I think I've experienced at least enough of a transition to have some kind of personal experience to speak from on this topic. And then maybe a little, just some thoughts from the scriptures and from general, maybe I don't know if I want to call it common sense or not, but we'll go with some thoughts to share. And as I mentioned to you, I've got a combination of some simply observations that I've made, some things to expect, some things I didn't really think about.
Okay.
It might be obvious to other people, that some things that I had to realize and get used to and accommodate, and then some suggestions and cautionary ideas along the way as well. I do have my thoughts kind of divided into some really the top of the list priorities for me, and then some miscellaneous things, and then some final words is how I have it down in my notes here.
Okay. Well, that sounds good. And I hope I'm not stepping on something we're going to say later. And if we are, then we can, circle back. But, nobody's saying here on this episode that you've arrived once you've hit a certain number of people within a congregation. Amen. Right. And honestly, you can do the work and serve the Lord faithfully and fruitfully regardless of what the size of the congregation might be. At the same time, I know that the individuals who submitted these requests I think are coming more from a different angle of, I do feel that there are different challenges, perhaps, or if nothing else, how do I scale myself to meet the needs of more people? And,
Yes.
I can definitely appreciate that too. So I'm excited as we dive into things today. You said you got some observations as we start.
Yes. And this one's a mix. I'd say it's observation / some suggestion. And it directly ties in with the idea of, how do I minister to 2 times, 3 times, 5 times or more as many people as I have been?
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it's a reminder, I guess is the right way to put it, that equipping is essential. And that I almost, at one point I had it worded in my thoughts that equipping becomes more important. And I don't know that that's the best way to put it, in that equipping is always important. It's just that maybe, for if nothing else, practical reasons, when you have more people that are, as we've said, that you're ministering to and serving as a minister in a local congregation, you're forced almost sometimes, if not otherwise, to focus and realize the importance of equipping.
Mm-hmm.
I doubt that any of our listeners are unfamiliar with passages like Ephesians 4, especially 11 and 12, where the Apostle Paul talks about various roles within a congregation in verse 11, and then that leads into, he says, this is to the equipping of the saints, that's all of us, for the work of ministry, or the ministry.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's observed fairly often that every child of God in one way is a minister or is a servant. We all have a ministry of service to be a part of, as a part of the ministry of the whole congregation toward Jesus, toward each other, and toward our communities. And I've realized even more that as you have more people that are a part of the congregation you're working with, that regardless of any co-ministers or not, or whatever the other situations or other parts of the situation may be, I've realized just how much and how important, how significant the role of a minister is, not to be the one guy that does everything,
Mm-hmm.
that makes all the visits, or does all the evangelism, all the Bible studies, just you name it, but to be the focus of a minister's task, perhaps especially a preaching minister,
Mm-hmm.
is that of helping, training, equipping the whole congregation, ideally, but at least as many people as possible within the local body, to serve and to perform that ministry in that way.
Mm-hmm.
I think you realize even more, the more people you have that you're working with, that you can't do it all. Whether you even should or shouldn't, that's not even the question. I mean, I don't think you should, even biblically speaking. But if you realize, I can't. Or if you even try, you're probably going to affect your health and all sorts of things. You're going to get stretched really thin, besides the fact that it's really impossible to do anyway.
Yeah.
And so I put that at the top of my list, that you realize, or you're reminded, that equipping other people to serve is just that important, that valuable in the work of a local church.
How do you think that looks? I mean, practically. I mean, does that look like first identifying people who have a heart for making visits or Bible studies, and maybe like having them accompany you, or you accompany them initially, and then going from there? Or I know it's a little bit tangential to our conversation here, but
Sure.
I'm sure eldership support, support from deacons and ministry leaders and things like that, that equipping aspect. And I think you're right. That is something, and maybe we don't emphasize that enough, or maybe we think of that more as an elder thing or a deacon thing. Evangelists are certainly included, depending on how you take that. The teachers, some translations will hyphenate it, pastor, teachers.
Right. Maybe
Maybe that's focused more on elders there in Ephesians 4. But nevertheless, preachers have a role in that equipping of the saints.
Yes. Yeah, I would agree that some form of mentoring is certainly a part of that aspect of equipping. I think it also factors into even the way that you preach and teach in a public format. There's ways that you can emphasize and bring in practical application that lends itself to that equipping, as we call it. Mm-hmm. There's certainly not just one way to go about it. I don't know that there's a magic formula or secret sauce. I certainly don't have it if there is to do that. But you have to realize that, realizing it needs to happen, and then start implementing practical ways. Yeah. Whether that is taking someone with you and I've seen, not just here, but in my observation of several congregations and conversations with other ministers, I've seen that there's a tendency, and this is just one, I found one, I guess you could call it a pro of a larger congregation sometimes, there's a tendency for the membership to be more aware of that, I think, as well. And it might just be they see, hey, we've got one guy and there's 300 of us. There's no way he can connect and reach all of us in the same way that he could, say, with 30. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I've seen that as well, which can be helpful when it comes to motivation, I guess, too.
Oh, it's nice to have grace from the people to whom we preach and minister, right?
Yes, sir.
I interrupted your thoughts there a minute ago, and you're continuing your observations. What were you going to say? I'm sorry.
You're fine. I'm just a guest. So.
Oh, come on.
I think I was going to talk about the old 80-20 rule that has been around for years. I don't know if anyone knows where it originated. And it certainly has its failings when it comes to trying to apply it in a very rigid way to ministry and churches. I think it originated in the business world. But there is some truth to at least the phenomenon of a certain smaller percentage of people, let's say 20, doing the other percentage of work and vice versa. That it's just a fact. Yeah. I don't know that it's PC to say it or whatever, but it is often some form of that is a reality, if not always some form, I guess. And you'll find that that's not going to change. You're always going to have your core, I think as some of us call them, of membership that are very active, very involved. They're always volunteering for anything and everything. They're going to be there every time the doors are open. It's usually the Sunday night, Wednesday night crowd of people. Often those align. I think you'll find that to not really change from a smaller to larger number of the congregation. So realize that, be prepared for that. Mm-hmm. But one blessing is that if you have, just because of the numbers, let's say it's still 25, 75 at a larger congregation, you are going to have still a larger group of people that are in that more active portion of the congregation. And that's an observation, but it's a blessing to appreciate that can help to support, and I don't know that augment's the right word here, but it can help with that struggle of how am I able to do all of this and take care of all the needs that are here at this congregation when it comes to that idea again of not stretching yourself too thin. Yeah. It's not a one-man show, which again it shouldn't be, but it certainly can't be as well. Mm-hmm.
My philosophy is that the Sunday and Wednesday night crowd, so to speak, is the core of the congregation. And, I don't mean to speak ill of people that you only see on Sunday mornings. And sometimes there are reasons for that, whatever it is, work schedule or the elderly who can't drive at night or things like that, exactly. Right? But at the same time, your workforce, as you said, generally speaking, are those the evening people. And, if you start with those, that sort of becomes your pool of resources, right? And the assumption too is, as you're emphasizing, and rightly so, that it's not just up to you anyway to figure all this out. You likely have an eldership and deacons that are also involved in this process, but you can certainly help, and there are certainly opportunities for which maybe preachers are uniquely responsible, per the guidance of the eldership and things like that will, that we have an opportunity to tap on shoulders and volunteer, or sometimes I've heard the phrase, I was voluntold, whatever it takes, right, to help people along.
Oh, yes. And then we've mentioned elderships a couple of times. Yeah. And this is something that I personally don't have experience with, and that I've been fortunate blessed is probably the right word. But every congregation I've worked with, I've always had shepherds overseeing my ministry. But that is often, when you're thinking about going from a smaller congregation to a larger one, that is fairly often, at least, something that you will experience, is working with no elders to having elders and deacons, all of that.
Yeah.
That's going to be a difference there. So I mentioned that as something that I think is important or relevant to this conversation, but it's probably its own podcast topic.
Yeah.
And it's also, as I said, it's not something I have any personal experience with beyond, or at least myself. So just mentioning that as a part of the conversation, I think I'll leave that there.
Yeah.
But something I do have experience with that is also along that same line, and this is not always the case. We have, for instance, a congregation in our area that is about our size in membership, and they only have one minister. But usually when you're thinking about a larger congregation, especially once you start getting to the 150, 250, 300 range, you're going to have co-ministers. You might have one, two, or more. And that in itself can be a big transition if you're used to being the only person financially supported on the, if you want to call it the paid staff, however you want to term that. For me, I went from being the only one at all to being a part of among five.
Wow.
We have two other ministers, and then a full-time and a part-time secretary. We also have a couple of janitors that are on staff. Not that is the same category, but still, part of what I'm getting at is you're going to have, it's just a different experience in general, having more people at the building during the day that are there because it's their job as well as yours. They're not just dropping by. All of that in itself is it's going to be different, quite different. But that also helps, especially co-ministers, with some of the workload, depending on what specific role you have. Of course, typically you're going to have a different assigned role, whether it's outreach minister, youth and family minister, preaching minister, and so on. That also factors into the question of, how can I do this? How can I handle this? Am I going to have to work 80 hours or 100 hours every week or whatever? When I'm thinking about, I've been working with 50 people now, I've got to work with 350 or whatever the situation specifically is. That also is a part of that. Just keep that in mind, that now, speaking to someone that is not going to have that blessing, it's not going to factor in for them, unfortunately. But that is a blessing for those of us who have those co-ministers, secretaries supporting. And I think about a balance here when it comes to your role. I think when we were considering the move here, Robert, you and I talked some about it, and I think one of the things we mentioned was the opportunity to wear fewer hats.
Yeah.
And that you can be a bit more specialized, a bit more focused in your own ministry. You're not having to do, for example, as many administrative tasks. If you have a secretary or secretaries, they can help with that, or any of these things we're talking about when it comes to the workload, whether it's visits or counseling or Bible studies and so on. There's that you can sometimes experience, as being able to be more focused and wear those fewer hats. I do think there's a balance there. I think of Acts chapter 6, verse 4, where the apostles, that's typically thought of as being the first deacons appointed there. Whole other discussion there too. But in verse 4, they decide to appoint these special servants. The apostles say, hey, it wouldn't be right or fitting for us to wait on tables. We need to devote ourselves to the word and to prayer. And there's a valuable application there in two directions. One is realizing, yes, there needs to be focus. Let's say if I am the preaching minister, I need to have my focus on actually that work. And of course, I'll add this anecdote there that there's the old adage that preachers only work two days a week, right?
Right.
So there is, it might even be more so that when you go to a larger place, because you have more people, that you could run into needing to learn to say no more, and that I have to work that day. I can't help you run your errands or whatever.
Yes.
So there's that balance, though, I think, of not allowing our pride, though, to factor in as well, or filter in to where, well, no, I can't do this. I can't help with the bulletin. That's the secretary's job. I'm the preacher.
That's right.
I think you can take Acts 6:4 to an extreme, even when it comes to the opportunity to be more focused, because you may have other people helping, even that are a part of the paid staff or financially supported work. I think that also is an important blessing, but also can be a danger or something to be cautioned or alert to ourselves concerning.
I think that's a good point. And we can, and I don't want to say anything to discourage maybe a brother who's a preacher, and maybe you're the, as we say, chief cook and bottle washer, right? I mean, you get it all done, and you're running copies of the bulletin, and maybe you're hand folding them, and you're also making the visits and preaching the sermons and teaching all the adult Bible classes, and maybe even coordinating youth functions. And that may be where you are, and, keep doing what you're doing. And we're thankful for that. There are often, when you're ministering to more people, then maybe there were, as you just mentioned, there are more financial resources as a part of that, which may open the doors for segmenting out some of those works, youth ministry, youth and family ministry, whatever, into different sections, and then putting certain ministers over those roles. It is different if you're coming out of where you were the only minister on staff, so to speak, and now you're coming into a role where you're one of two or even one of three, or as you said, you're adding in secretaries and things like that. You sort of have to know what your role is so that you're not getting out of your lane and veering over into somebody else's work. And it's like you say, it's not that I'm not willing to do that stuff, but the way that this is organized within the office work, so to speak, this is the secretaries are going to do this, and I'm going to do this or whatever, and to know that and to stay in that lane is helpful. And first of all, because you don't want that frustration of, why is he all the time coming behind me and trying to do what I'm supposed to be doing? You don't want that situation. Sure. But then at the same time too, like when I can focus, we all have those weeks where preaching seems to be the lowest item of importance, and it's developing the sermons, that is. I don't have any time to get this done, and so you're getting up extra early, you're trying to get into the study before the phones start ringing or before commitments are going to come due or whatever it is. But if I find myself in that situation over and over and over and over again, it could be that there's an opportunity for someone else to be doing some of that, and let me focus on the ministry of the word while someone else is focusing on things that are important too, but maybe things that other people could do, whereas I'm the only person that's going to be standing up to preach this Sunday. And again, I'm not saying that if that's your position where you need to do all those things, understand. And I think we ought to be busy. I don't think we ought to be just loafing along. No. But yes, when you're in a larger congregation, there are perhaps more people with whom we get to work, and that's a blessing. But we also want to work well, within those situations too. So it is something. It's another thing just to add to. You keep that in the back of your mind, and we're co-laborers. Even if you're talking about a minister and a secretary, we're co-laborers. We don't have the same job, but we're working toward the same end, and that is, the ministry to this congregation, which is a good thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I don't know that I could emphasize enough the importance of working together, as you were, I think, alluding to. Even if there's a balance there too, and I hope I'm not saying there's a balance too many times here, but balance is key in so much of life and so much of ministry. But as you said, I actually had that phrase in my notes here of stay in your lane. But at the same time, I think there's a balance there, even if
that's right. Let's
say, just because I'm not the youth and family minister, let's say, there's a 17-year-old that's wanting to study the Bible with me. Well, I mean, I got to be careful there that,
right.
That's the youth minister's job, right?
Good point. Yep.
And that's just one example of plenty out there of be willing to work together. I'm more fortunate here that I'm able to make visits pretty often with at least one of my co-ministers. There's a lot of different things you can do together like that as well that help to strengthen your ministries individually and collectively.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important as well for each person that's a part of this team, if we want to call them that, to encourage communication, encourage a healthy relationship where you're, as you said, you're co-laborers. You're not something I think about when it comes to like we said with secretaries, is that they don't work for you. They're not your personal assistants.
Good point.
They are, they have their role, they have their work. You may work together, and their work may support and aid your work at times. But I had that down as a caution to not abuse that relationship. And I'm not necessarily talking about purity. I mean, that, of course, that should be in place in the office and things, but more. I mean, I've heard of preachers that would approach a secretary that way, to where it was like their personal assistant, and they need to always be ready for whatever they needed done and all of that. There's a caution there. It's another thing that can be of great blessing, but can also have and a lot of this, I don't know that it's ever intentional that someone sets out to do any of this type of thing, but it can be something we can fall into without even realizing it. It's another reason we must be careful and watch ourselves, be self-examining all of that along the way.
And sometimes, in fact, quite often, there's not like a piece of paper that has everybody's job description detailed down to the nth degree, right? And so if you're the new guy in this larger congregation, it may take what I call, 6 months to a year of observation mode, and you being willing to step up and fill in the gaps, so
figure out where you fit in.
Yeah, exactly. Figure out where you fit in. And, do you write the bulletin article? All right. Well, does the secretary put the bulletin article into the bulletin, or do you go in and do that yourself? Do you, how does all of that work, and be willing to do those sorts of things? And then after a while, and maybe you sit down too and say, hey, previously, how did this go? How did this work? Help me understand what you need me to do for you too, rather than just the secretary all the time saying, what can I do for you? So like I say, two-way street.
Yeah, it's a good conversation to have with your shepherds as well as with the others in the office staff, whether that's everyone meeting together or however you go about that. It's probably a good conversation to have up front when you're beginning the work, or even interviewing for the work, perhaps. And then even after that, some follow-up of, at times, periodically, you might just sit down and say, is this working? What isn't working?
Yeah.
I think a lot of it does come down to your attitude, your heart, of if you have a desire to help and to support the work of the ministry, realizing that the ultimate goal is glorifying Jesus, helping others to do the same, then some of these practical matters become easier to work out when everyone is on that same heart page when it comes to ministry. Yeah.
Good thoughts. It's funny because there is a lot to think about, and even things like that being a team player mentality. I think that's such an important thing, and frankly, you ought to be a team player, right? No matter what the size of the congregation is. It's just there's more of an awareness among let's say office staff, quote unquote, that we're a part of a team here. And to work together, I think is really good. Yes. And I try and emphasize that certainly with me toward the elders. I want to be a team player. I want to know what my role is. I'm not trying to infringe on their role, but I am here to support them and to help them however I can, or even minister to them as I have opportunity. And the same thing with deacons. I know my role is different from theirs. And, sometimes there are opportunities as a minister when you could sort of veer over into the deacon lane, leading different thises or that's. And, while you're willing to do that, at the same time, I don't want to launch into something for the young people, for example. And meanwhile, the youth deacon is over there saying, well, what am I here for? So as an example there, but, team player is important consideration there.
Yeah. And that along that line, that was something else I had down was you're going to have more activities, more things by nature of having more people. Connects back to what we were saying, I think you mentioned earlier, with even financial resources, more buildings perhaps, or a larger building, all of those things. And that's something for me, it's been a sigh of relief for the past 5 years at different times to realize, well, no, I don't have to lead that or have to be involved. I don't even have to attend necessarily that activity. Not of course, you can go to the other extreme there where, my job is preaching and I'm in the office studying, and then so I don't really have to be a part of that.
Right.
But it's a good thing at times for our own pride, though, I think, to realize No, I don't have to have my fingers in every pie. I don't have to be a part of all these different things. And it's healthy, going back to that equipping, that, hey, this can be successful and I don't have anything to do with it at all. And that's good. And I'm excited about that. I mean, there's probably some things like a ladies' tea that would be less successful if I was involved in it.
You make a good point. Yeah.
So there's that. I think I already said you have to learn to say no if you haven't already learned to say no, even at a smaller word.
Mm-hmm.
Along that line as well, during the day, you're going to have more interruptions. You might not, but I've experienced that at least, because you have more people coming in for different reasons.
Good point.
The office is going to be noisier. If you're used to being that, what did we say, the one guy that's there, you might get used to a pretty quiet building during the day. That's not going to happen when you have multiple people already working in the office, and then you add to that people coming in for visits, for counseling, on and on, et cetera. I should probably just stop there and say, be more concise there. But that's something that I had to get used to. Some of those differences. You're going to have the benefit of having more time off. Usually if you have co-ministers, you have in-house fill-in preachers. So there's that. Keep in mind that is something to look forward to if you're making that transition, that you're probably going to have more vacation time. You might even have certain times during the month that is the youth minister's time to preach or whatever anyway, even when you're not technically on vacation, all of that. And then I know we're probably well at a time here, but as I kind of wrap my thoughts up, you started here, so I'm going to end here. That's all right. But you're like, well, I don't know exactly where you're going, Gantt. But I think it's important for us to realize as ministers that if we're thinking about that transition, that moving from a smaller to a larger, regardless, again, of what those numbers exactly are, that we're not necessarily going to have less problems, or that things are going to just be better. It's that old grass isn't green on the other side thing.
Right.
And that the problems may be different, just like some of these challenges are different, but you're still going to have people problems. You're still going to have problems. There will still be those. And I ran across this quote earlier in an article on this idea of transitioning from a different size congregation. It's pretty straightforward, but it's concise. So here it is. It says, people still sin, bullies still attack, leaders will still disappoint, stress will still get intense. And then I really like this last part, but the groom still loves his bride. I thought that was well put.
Wow.
A well put reminder that you're not going to ever find a problem-free congregation.
Yes.
And so be prepared for that. Don't expect that. Realize be aware of some of these challenges that are, as we said, that will challenge us as ministers. And then realize that we're not talking about success. And this is really where I was headed earlier. The business world defines success as climbing the ladder of different, getting promotions or making more money or being at a bigger company. That one really hits home, right? And that it's easy for us as ministers to fall into the competitive mindset or the stepping stone mindset, where it's, well, I'm going to go to this congregation and then I'll be there for a while and then I'll see if I can find even larger congregation and all of that. Not that I'm saying if you've done that, if that's how your ministry has gone, that's not wrong.
Yeah.
That attitude can be dangerous, of thinking of congregations as just these stepping stones to something bigger and better. When again, it may not even be better for that matter, period. There's the quote that there are no competing lighthouses. And that applies to the co-minister discussion we had earlier. It applies to different congregations, all of that. We're all in this overall work of the Lord together in his kingdom. Let's not lose sight of that.
Those are good. I think about that competition, that it may be unspoken competition between ministers. If you have a youth and family minister or a, insert distinction here, minister, there are definitely going to be things that he is better at than you are. And, there may be some things that you are more specialized at or more experienced in than he is. And, you can get down to this, and sometimes the membership can sniff this out. Yeah, they can. Yeah, you're right. They can even encourage it, in thinking, okay, well, I really prefer his personality or the style of his preaching when he gets to preach, and so I'm going to come to him for weddings, funerals, counseling. And you can get in your head about that, and just don't. I mean, if if those people are being ministered to, and they're being served the word, and they connect with certain personalities as a part of all that process, then we rejoice in that, and we're grateful for that. But I just need to keep my heart free from that sort of thing, and work really hard to where I'm not building this environment that it's me against you or you against me. And instead, we're this part of this team together. I think that's really, really important.
Yes.
And when I think about ministering to larger congregations, and whether that and I appreciate what you said at the beginning. Your definition of a larger congregation may vary, right? 100, 150, 2, 3, 4, 5, 600, whatever it is, 1,000 people. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is to make these congregations feel smaller. and we're doing that by fostering connections and relationship. And, the last thing any congregation wants is what so many congregations hear. I am there, but I don't feel like anybody notices that I'm there. And if I'm not there, will anybody care? And that's what we don't want. And to your point, when you're dealing or ministering to, I was going to say dealing with, it doesn't sound quite right, but when you're ministering to 150, 200, 250 people, sometimes if you're the only person watching out or visiting or following up, sometimes people will fall through the cracks, especially if you have a family and you've got people that you're supposed to take care of. They're your priority more than, all the other people,
right.
Your wife and your children. And so, we're trying to make all this feel a little smaller. And I'm thinking like cliques and things like that can develop among any size of people. And if you're in a smaller rural congregation, then you may have family cliques. If you're in a larger urban congregation, then you may have, age group cliques or, whatever. And to try and help people through some of that. I mean, personalities are going to naturally gravitate toward one another. But to help each other appreciate the differences and exist in unity and fellowship in spite of some of those natural tendencies that we might have to divide from one another are certainly important things too. But I think your suggestions, your observations, your cautions are so wise, and I can identify with every one of them. I'm just appreciative of what you said there. So let's take a quick break, and then we'll have some opportunities, Gantt, to just round this out a little bit, or final closing observations before we conclude this episode. But I want to remind those of you who are listening or watching that Preachers in Training is part of the Light Network, a network of podcasts designed to encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. And if you have not checked out the other episodes that are a part of this podcast, this is season 14. We've got 13 other seasons, over, 150 to 200 episodes previously of Preachers in Training. You can go back and listen to the last time that Gantt was with us and hear about him talking about preaching without notes or any of the others. I'd encourage you to go and check those out. TheLightNetwork.tv is where you can find those. By the way, sometimes if you go to a podcast app, they'll only show you the most recent 50 or so episodes, and we've got a lot more than that. So go to our website, thelightnetwork.tv. You can search for certain topics, certain guests, or just scroll through the archives there. It's really easy to find Preachers in Training. Just click the image that says Preachers in Training. By the way, though, we have about 11 other podcasts that release every week from thelightnetwork.tv on their respective weekdays. Go and check those out as well. I think there's something there that you or someone you know will enjoy. Audio and video versions of the podcast are available for subscription. You can subscribe via audio at any podcast app, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and the like. And you can watch the video version on YouTube. Hit the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. And brand new episodes of this podcast release every Thursday from those channels and ultimately from our website, thelightnetwork.tv. We're talking about how to minister to a larger congregation with Gantt Carter from Elk City, Oklahoma, Second and Adams congregation there. Gantt, there's a lot to think about, a lot of considerations. I'm sure this is not exhaustive, but wow, you've really covered a lot of ground for us. As we land the plane a little bit, I know you've shared your thoughts, but is there anything else you want to say to a brother, just in closing, parting words, who is now finding himself ministering to a larger congregation?
Sure. I'll give my bottom line, and I mentioned this to you when you first asked about being on this podcast, that the real ultimate answer with any of this is to do your work.
Yeah.
To, like Paul told Timothy, there's that popular passage for good reason, to preach the word.
Yeah.
2 Timothy 4, right?
Yeah.
And to fulfill your ministry, to do the work of an evangelist, regardless of any of the other details, the congregation size, whether you have co-ministers, whether you have secretaries, regardless of what your eldership's like, or if you have an eldership, the core of what you do as a minister, whether that is sermon prep or visitation, counseling, any of these things we've talked about already, the mechanics or the basics of what you do as a minister is and should remain the same. And that you are ministering the circumstance, that's the variance there, that's the difference. But who you are as a minister before your king and what you actually do as a minister, that really is, that's do your work. That's the answer to the whole question to me. Is we can, sometimes it's easy to overthink it. I know we spent a whole podcast talking about it, and so I'm not saying not to do that, but I think we can overthink all of this to where it's all about the differences and the challenges and all of that, and we forget that I need to do my work, my ministry for the Lord and for his people.
Good thoughts. Absolutely. Read an article from the Jenkins Institute the other day, and they summarized it: preach the word and love the people. Yeah, that seems about right, doesn't it?
Yes.
Brother, we appreciate your time. It's always great to catch up with you, and your observations have just been wonderful and spot on. Appreciate your work, and thanks for your time today on Preachers in Training.
Hey, thank you, Robert. Appreciate you and all that you do. I do.
Yeah, thank you, brother. And we appreciate you all for listening to this episode of Preachers in Training, and hope you'll join us next week when Dan Winkler joins us to talk about the place of preaching in modern society. Really, really neat observations and conversations. We've actually already recorded that one as well, and so I know what he says, but you'll have to wait until next time. Preachers in Training, Season 14, Episode 4, coming your way next Thursday. Until then, though, thanks for being with us today. I'm Robert Hatfield. Let's go preach the word.